Current section, yeah. I'm going to talk about something which I think most people find very interesting, and whether different years and tell us something about it in one time.
Thanks, Juliana. Thanks everyone for coming. I know it's beautiful out, and some of you had to rush during lunch. I appreciate it. Thanks to Christian and Damiano for organizing. It's been a really fun week, and I think lots of great philosophy has happened so far. There's another day left. And with that in mind, I wanted to put in a plug for the Philosophy of Time Society, which many folks in this room have contributed to over the years. Right now, it's being led by myself and Dave Ingram, who's here, and Marta, who might be here, who's been around. One of the main tasks or activities of the Philosophy of Time Society is organizing group sessions at each of the American Philosophical Association meetings each year. And the deadline to submit an abstract to be considered for presenting at the Eastern APA, which will be in New York next January, is July 1st. So it's very soon. And you can stay tuned if you won't make that deadline for the deadlines for the Central and the Pacific. So just wanted to put that out there since I know many of you have papers that are potentially ready to go after this week. Okay, so my topic today is very broad, and in some ways, the arguments that I'll be making is maybe a little bit abstract. I'm going to try to kind of make sure they make contact with more specific and concrete details, but I am interested in saying something about this very broad group of arguments, and as a result, the nature of what I'm going to be saying is a little bit more on the general and abstract side. The group of arguments that I'm interested in are metaphysical arguments from temporal experience. So this is any argument that starts from a claim about some feature or aspect of our temporal experience, and then uses that claim to support a further claim about the metaphysics of time. So what time is like. Many folks in this room have made arguments of this sort. Many folks in this room have critiqued arguments of this sort. And there's a long historical precedent here that I am definitely not qualified to say anything at all about. There are many contemporary arguments of this type. I'm going to focus as kind of a paradigm case just to get us started on the version of it that shows up in Lori Paul's 2010 JTL paper, Temporal Experience. So here's what Paul says. I step out of my house into the morning air and feel the cool breeze on my face. I feel the freshness of the cool breeze now, and as the breeze dies down, I notice that time is passing. I need to start walking, or I will be late for class. This morning, I went hiking and with Heather, and we were on top of the mountain. It was really windy, and I was thinking about the fact that I was going to be talking about this quote because I was feeling the wind, and then it died down, and I definitely felt time passing because I didn't want to miss my talk. Lori goes on to say that everybody has experiences like this, and that's very real to me, especially today. The question, she says, that I want to explore is whether we should take this suggestion to support an anti-reductionist ontology of time. That is, whether we should take it to support an ontology that includes a primitive, monadic property of nowness, responsible for the special feel of events in the present, and a relation of passage that events instantiate in virtue of literally passing from the future to the present and then into the past. Okay, so here's the big picture claim that I'm going to make. I'm going to build to the claim by starting with two relatively obvious points. One, metaphysical arguments from temporal experience, I'm going to call them MTEs, are often used to argue for various versions of the A theory. This is very much true in the Paul quote that we just saw. So she's arguing, or she's considering whether this aspect of our temporal experience establishes a theory in which there's this primitive monadic property of A-ness and this genuine sense of passage of events from future to past. Second, relatively obvious claim, versions of the A theory are often taken to be in tension with our best science. So with both of these claims, there's a lot of nuance here. There's arguments. You can argue about either of them, but I take it that they're relatively widely established. And therefore, I think it would be really easy to have the view that if you are a naturalist, you ought to steer clear of metaphysical arguments from temporal experience. So when I talk about naturalism, what I mean is the general attitude that takes scientific inquiry to be a paradigm type of inquiry into what the world is like. If you are a naturalist and you're doing philosophy, then you think that as you do philosophy, you need to be respectful of our best science in some sense. So if you have that naturalistic attitude and you are aware of these two kind of general ideas in the background, one that MTEs are usually used to argue for the A theory. So if you are a naturalist and you have two general claims in mind, one, that metaphysical arguments are often used to argue for versions of the A theory, and the other, that the A theory is in tension with science, you might think, well, I'm not interested in these kinds of arguments. I don't want to take experience as a starting place. I want to start from some other point, something to do with science. Okay, so I think this is a mistake. I think that naturalists can and should be interested in metaphysical arguments from temporal experience, not because I want to call into question either of the two sort of quote unquote obvious claims that I started with. I think those claims, like I said before, can be questioned. I myself am on record raising questions about the second of those claims, that the A theory is in fact in tension with our best science, but we can set all that aside. Even if you accept both of those claims and you're a naturalist, I think you can and should still be interested in these types of arguments. So here's the plan. I'm going to start by categorizing metaphysical arguments from temporal experience in general as involving inference to the best explanation, and say something about what I mean by that and some of what it tells us about how we ought to go about engaging with these arguments. I don't think it tells us very much, just to warn you ahead of time. I think it gives us a structure for thinking about these arguments, but I think that it's the value of thinking about MTEs as versions of inference to the best explanation is that it points us in the right direction for the further work that we need to do in terms of spelling out exactly what we mean by one explanation being better than another. Second, I'm going to argue that many standard versions of metaphysical arguments from temporal experience are using a specific understanding of inference to the best explanation. What they're arguing is that we need to adopt the A theory given some aspect of our temporal experience, because that is the only explanation. If the A theory were not true, then that aspect of our temporal experience would go without any explanation at all. So this is a type, on my view, of inference to the best explanation. It's inference to the only explanation. Explanation is best because it's the only one available, but I don't think it's the only kind of inference to the best explanation. And identifying that helps us see that there's more space for metaphysical arguments from temporal experience than I think is sometimes recognized in the literature. And that's the space that I think we should be more interested in, and in particular that I think naturalists should explore in more detail. I'm then going to give a specific naturalistic alternative to what I am calling the standard version of an MT. I flagged right up front that this particular alternative is going to be controversial. I'm aware of that because it's built on an argument that I've made several times in recent papers and then also in my recent book on naturalism. So I've presented this argument many times. It often gets folks worked up. I bet it will get you worked up. That's okay. That can be fun in philosophy, but I want to be really clear about which aspects of my big picture claim turn on that controversial argument and which are independent. And the idea that most of the big picture view that I'm putting forward is actually independent of that specific detail. Even if you don't like the naturalistic alternative that I like, you should still take on board the rest of what I'm saying. Okay, so that's why I'm owning up front the fact that it's a controversial alternative. And then I'll close with what I take to be some open questions that all this leaves us with. Okay, so start with just some framing. MTEs can vary on 3 axes. So there's 3 sort of moving parts that you can tinker with to adjust one MTE to create a new version. One is a particular aspect of experience that is taken to support some metaphysical thesis. The second is the type of support that the relevant aspect of experience provides for that metaphysical thesis. And the third is the metaphysical thesis that's being supported. I think the first and the third are interesting, but my focus here is really going to be on the second. And again, the thought is that this is relatively underexplored in the literature on these subjects. So what I'm interested in is the type of support and the ways in which that can vary across different versions of. What I'm claiming, as I already previewed, is that the type of support in general that metaphysical arguments from temporal experience are putting forward is some kind of inference to the best explanation. You can find this in the literature. So here again is Paul from the same paper, partly why I chose the paper, says the anti-reductionist holds that our experience as of the nowness of events is best explained by ascribing the irreducible monadic temporal property of nowness to events, and that our experience as of the passage of events is best explained by holding that time actually passes, that is, that events do not merely stand in unchanging relations of being earlier than, later than, or simultaneous with other events. I also think even if those putting forward these MTEs or critiquing them, as Paul ends up actually doing, saying explicitly, just by thinking about the structure of the argument, we can arrive at the conclusion that these are plausibly thought of as instances of inference to the best explanation. So what these arguments involve is, on the one hand, you have something happening in our experience that's supposed to be represented by the star, what's in the star inside the head. So we have an experience as of the wind blowing across your face. And then you have something out in the world, namely the wind actually blowing. And the thing out in the world is supposed to, in some sense, generate, cause, explain the thing that's happening in your head. And I take it that there's questions. The question that MTEs give rise to is precisely like, what is this thing that's out in the world that's explaining your experience? Is it, in fact, some primitive monadic property of nowness or some genuine passage? What is this thing that I'm representing with this symbol? But I take it that everybody thinks that there's something out here that is explaining what's happening in your head, at least in the good case. So arguments that use what's happening in your head to then make a conclusion about what has to be happening out here are just by their very structure inference. They involve inference to the best estimate. Now, the way I've set this up is oversimplified, right? So for one thing, you might have, in addition to the macroscopic phenomena that you are observing, the wind blowing, you might have a fundamental level that is explaining the macroscopic, what's happening at the macroscopic level. There also might be intermediate steps in between the thing out in the world at the macroscopic level and your experience, but that are happening kind of within you. So some processing that's happening in your brain as you take in some stimulus and then use it to construct an experience. When you unpack it in this way, I think it shows that there's different, I'm eliding over different kinds of explanation here very plausibly. So it's very plausible that the sense in which whatever's happening at the fundamental level explains this macroscopic phenomena, that's presumably something like grounding or generation, giving rise to whatever words you want to use for that. The sense of explanation that holds between the macroscopic phenomena and whatever's happening inside your brain, I think it's very plausibly causal. And then the sense of explanation that's happening between your brain and your experience is very plausibly, again, something like grounding or generation, giving rise to some kind of non-causal dependence. Nonetheless, I think all of this is still, it's a very complicated explanatory structure, but it's still, all the parts of it are parts of an explanatory structure. So again, I think we can plausibly think of these arguments as inference to the best explanation. So here's a little pedantic schema for how to think about MTEs as inference to the best explanation. The first premise is some claim about the nature of temporal experience. The second premise is the claim that the best explanation of first premise, is some metaphysical theory. And then the third premise is that therefore we should adopt the metaphysical theory that's identified in 2. So far so good. However, I don't think that we can make a lot of progress just by recognizing this argument structure, because I think so much is packed into the notion of the best explanation in the second premise. One way that I like to think about it is that whatever the sub-argument is that establishes that second premise, well, there are many different sub-arguments that could be used to establish that second premise, depending on what you mean by the best explanation. So what I like about spelling this out really clearly is I think it clearly shows that the burden is on anyone who wants to make an argument of this sort to be clear about what this second premise is. So what do you mean by one explanation being better than the other? In what sense is an explanation that cites the relevant metaphysical theory better than the alternatives? And I think the burden is on those who critique these arguments to make sure that they are clear on what role, what sense of best explanation is at play in the argument, so that they don't end up making a straw man. The other thing that I like about putting this in this form is that I think it shows, getting the order of my own slide. All right, sorry. So the key claims that I've made so far, I'm arguing that metaphysical arguments from temporal experience involve inference to the best explanation, and that when you're making or critiquing an MT, you need to specify the relevant sense of best explanation. Surprisingly, this does not regularly happen in the literature. The other thing that I like about emphasizing the role of inference to the best explanation here is that I think it explicitly makes room, or maybe it's explicit in my head, but it leaves room for naturalistic considerations to come into play. So I just wrote a whole book about naturalism and could talk about it for the rest of the afternoon, which I promise not to do. Here are 2, so I think naturalism is a word that has escaped semantic control, so I'm not going to try to say what naturalism is. I'm just going to talk about 2 kinds of naturalism that I am interested in. The first is content naturalism. So this is the view that metaphysicians should not accept theories that conflict with the content of our best scientific theories. The second is methodological naturalism, that says that when you're choosing between candidate theories, metaphysicians should, whenever possible, use the same methodology that scientists use. So both of these views are naturalistic in the sense that they are, when you do philosophy this way, you are respecting science, but they are focused on different aspects of our best science. The content naturalist is respecting the content of our best science, sort of the final product out of science, whereas the methodological naturalist is interested in respecting the methodology that produces that content. So the observation that we started with, that A theories are often taken to be in conflict with our best science, our best scientific theories, that is a worry for the content naturalist. But it's not obviously on the face of it a worry for the methodological naturalist. For the methodological naturalists, when they look at that schema for metaphysical arguments from temporal experience, they are not worried about what the conclusion is of the argument and whether or not that conflicts with our best scientific theories. They're worried about the premises of the argument itself and whether or not those premises cohere with the methodology that scientists use. And inference to the best explanation, I think, is plausibly something that might be part of our best scientific methodology. It depends on what you mean by best, okay? And what you mean by one explanation being better than another. So there's room here, regardless of what happens with worries about conflicts between the A theory and our best scientific theories, for a naturalist to be interested in these metaphysical arguments from temporal experience, because they are a methodological naturalist. And because they are interested in a understanding of one explanation being better than another, that also plays a role in our best scientific methodology. Okay, so I'm going to continue to have methodological naturalism in the background throughout the rest of what I say. I'll say a little bit about content naturalism again at the end, and I'm happy for questions about any of this during the Q&A. But before I go on, I just want to say, I want to address two sort of immediate objections that folks sometimes have that leads them to think that methodological naturalism is a non-starter. Because if you have either of these objections in your head, you might think that, well, that version of naturalism is non-starter, so none of the things that I would say about it later are going to help very much. The first objection is one that I tend to encounter from folks that haven't spent, that are not very engaged with philosophy of science, or that's not their the sort of playground that they are working in. And this is the worry that, well, methodological naturalism, even if it's true, is going to be trivial. It's not going to have any interesting consequences for philosophy, because what is the methodology of science? You know, it's like the stuff we do in labs or at observatories. It involves these big, complicated experimental setups, and those kinds of big, complicated experimental setups, they just don't tell us anything about whether one philosophical theory is better than another. Okay. So I say a lot about that worry in the book. I'll give you the very short version. I think anybody who has that worry is wrong about the methodology of science. So I think the methodology of science involves complicated experimental setups and the collection of empirical data. I think it also involves a whole lot of extra empirical reasoning. Reasoning that takes you from the set of theories that are consistent with the data you've collected to some final theory. And inference to the best explanation, i.e. principles that focus on different kinds of explanatory quality, are precisely the kinds of things that are at least candidates for that sort of extra empirical reasoning. The second initial worry that folks sometimes have about methodological naturalism tends to come from folks who are like steeped in the philosophy of science literature, like this is what they think about all the time. And this worry is, whoa, methodological naturalism, if true, makes metaphysics way too hard. So like, I read my Kuhn, he was trying to figure out what all this extra empirical reasoning is. He didn't get to the bottom of it. Everybody's been trying ever since. It's a big mess. We don't have any systemization. So now if I adopt methodological naturalism, it's going to be super hard. I'm going to have to spend all this time thinking about how science works, and it's going to be hard to make progress. Okay. So I don't say a ton about that in the book. I have a response. It's short, and I'll give all of it to you here. The response is, nobody ever promised you that metaphysics was going to be easy. If they did, they lied. So yeah, it might be that methodological naturalism makes metaphysics hard. It might be that it means that it's really hard to do good metaphysics without knowing a lot of science. Those things might be difficult, but I think that we should accept them. Okay, so the key claims of this section, we should think of metaphysical arguments from temporal experience as involving inference to the best explanation. You're making or critiquing one of these arguments, you have to be clear about the relevant sense of best explanation. Whether or not one of these arguments is naturalistic is going to depend then on whether the relevant type of IDE, i.e. the relevant sense of best explanation, also plays a role in scientific methodology. But by this point, I think this alone, I think, is enough to get the naturalist interested. If you're a naturalist, you should be interested in these arguments. You shouldn't have just written them off when somebody told you that the A theory conflicted with our best science, and we're done. All right, here's what I take to be, some discussion of what I take to be the standard version of MTEs. So here I'll show you a few quotes from other versions of the argument in the literature, both by those putting the argument forward and by those critiquing them. So here's Caspar Hare saying it very clearly. He says, realism about tense is uniquely capable of making sense of the phenomenology of temporal experience. Here is Dean Zimmerman talking specifically about the temporal value asymmetry as an aspect of experience. So he says, when I notice that a headache or some other painful episode has become part of the past, I'm relieved that this is so. And when a pleasant experience becomes past, I'm often disappointed. If a theory of time makes such changes in attitude utterly mysterious, we should have grave doubts about its adequacy. So I think in both of these versions, both of these sort of discussions of metaphysical arguments from temporal experience, the emphasis is on the idea that if you don't adopt some version of the A theory, it's a different version in each type, but that's fine. If you don't adopt some version of the A theory, then you will leave the relevant kind of temporal experience without any explanation at all. Okay, so what Hare is saying is that the A theory is uniquely capable of explaining the experience. What Zimmerman's saying is that you didn't have an A theory, then the experience would be utterly mysterious, which I take to be without any explanation. Here's an example of someone who is critiquing an MTE. So this is Callender and Suler. They are specifically, one of the paradigm examples that they're critiquing is actually the Zimmerman quote that I just put up there. So they say, as we saw earlier, philosophers of time have attempted to use the existence of the temporal value asymmetry to argue for strong conclusions about the metaphysics of time. They contend that the temporal value asymmetry is inexplicable. If the eternalist view of time is correct, the account just developed gives lie to such claims. So Callender and Suler are disagreeing with the idea that the only explanation of the relevant kind of temporal experience is an A theory, but they accept that that's the argument that's being put forward. And then here is Paul's reconstruction of the anti-reductionist argument that she introduced in those quotes earlier. Like I said, she ultimately ends up critiquing this. She reconstructs the argument as having two premises about explanation. So in those earlier quotes, she was explicit that she thinks this is about inference to the best explanation. She thinks this is about what is the best explanation of our experience. But she first puts forward a premise that says that the thesis that there are temporal properties of nowness and passage provides the only reasonable explanation of why we have these experiences. So she moves from saying this is the only explanation to saying that it's the best. Okay, so all of these suggest to me, there's lots of other examples in the literature. These are just the ones that I chose. The standard MTEs say that some version of the A theory provides the best explanation of our temporal experience because they provide the only explanation. One way to think about this is you can distinguish between inference to the best explanation and inference to the existence of an explanation, where the latter says that if some fact is going to go unexplained, if we didn't accept the relevant theory, then we should accept that theory. IEE, as it's construed here, is a type of IBE, but it doesn't exhaust IBE. Okay, so there will be versions of IBE that go beyond IEE. That's helpful for you to think about it that way. So here's the schema for what I take to be the standard version of the metaphysical argument of temporal experience. It just takes that second premise and breaks it into two. The reason why the best explanation of one is the metaphysical theory that shows up that's under discussion is because it's the only explanation. The main thing that I want to say about these arguments, I don't want to say too much about whether or not they're naturalistic or not, because I don't think that they are really the best version of the arguments to put forward. And that's because I think it's just too easy to object to what in this schema I have as premise 2A, that this is the only explanation available. Really, the only way to support that premise is by placing some very strong restrictions on your notion of explanation, and then those restrictions themselves are something that you end up having to defend. So I'm not saying that it can't be done, but I think this is a really hard way to go if you're interested in metaphysical arguments from temporal experience, to argue that they really are the only possible explanation. But I don't think that that should be too worrisome, even recognizing papers like the Callender and Suler paper that I talked about before, or Paul's paper that call into question the idea that the only explanation available for these experiences is one in terms of the A theory. I don't think that should make the fan of MTEs all that worried. One way of thinking about it is look at this reconstruction. So we've got 4 premises here. Ultimately, what Paul does in her paper, and I think she does it in a relatively convincing way, is she attacks premise 3. But it's not obvious at all that even if premise 3 is false, the argument doesn't go through. It looks to me like the argument goes through just on the basis of premises 1, 2, and 4. I think you would need to put forward an alternative reason for thinking that premise 4 is true. But it's not like the argument is dead in the water just because premise 3 is false. So that's what I think that a fan of MTEs should do. I think that the standard version emphasizes the A theory as being the only available explanation of hard to defend, but fans of MTE can consider arguments that the A theory provides the best explanation in some further sense at best. Because I'm a naturalist, I think we should pay particular attention to senses of best explanation that plausibly play a role in standard scientific methodology. And if you can identify some such notion of best explanation to build your MTE on, then I think not only do you have an argument that might withstand the kind of objections that, say, Paul and Callender and Sewler have made, but you'll have an argument that you can defend as naturalistic. Okay, so this is the point where we transition from things that I really think everybody should accept to things that I know are going to be more controversial. Well, I still think you should accept my controversial arguments because I think it's right. But I guess what I want to say is that even if you don't like what happens in the next section, you shouldn't give up everything. You should only retreat this far. This all still stands. Okay? I've like primed everybody to think I'm going to give a completely nuts argument, which sometimes people do. Okay, so here's a controversial naturalistic alternative. So again, what I'm looking for here is a version of best explanation, a sense of best explanation that plays a role in standard scientific methodology, and where you could argue on that basis that the A theory provides a better explanation of our temporal experience than any alternative B theory. So to kind of warm you up, I want you to think about 2 different ways in which an explanation can be simple. On the one hand, the explanans, the thing that is doing the explaining itself can be simple. On the other hand, the explanatory relations that hold between the explanans and the explananda can be simple. So the mapping, you might say, between the thing that's doing the explaining and the thing that's being explained is relatively straightforward on the second notion of simplicity. That might be the case even if the thing doing the explaining itself is a complicated kind of thing. Okay, here's an example, just like a toy example. So I'm supposed to having experience as of seeing an apple. And suppose here are 2 different explanations for me having that experience. On the one hand, there's an apple before me. On the other hand, there is a banana before me. Now I take it that apples and bananas are like equally complicated in and of themselves. So insofar as you're focused on the simplicity or lack thereof in the explanans, you should think these are a wash, right? Equally simple in terms of the explanation. But something much more complicated is happening in here, right? In the relation between the thing in the world and my experience of the thing in the world in the second case. Okay. So the second explanation, I think, is a more complicated explanation in the sense that the relations between the explanans and the explananda are more complicated. Not in the sense that the explanans itself is a more complicated kind of thing. Oh boy, that's exciting. Okay, so that was the kind of warm up. What I'm going to argue for is a principle that says that we should prioritize explanations that are simple in the second kind of sense. And this principle, I'm giving it to you in a relatively complicated form because that's the form that it's already out in the literature. I don't want to confuse things by having multiple different versions out there. what the argument says is that insofar as you have two or more candidate theories, and both of them are explanatorily and empirically adequate. Okay, so they explanatorily and empirically adequate is just a way of characterizing just like some basic constraints that rule out theories that shouldn't be plausible candidates at all. I can say more about what those mean in the Q&A if you want. The important part is you ought to choose a theory that diverges least from the way that the world appears to be. So this principle would prioritize the top explanation over the second kind of explanation. It would say that the top explanation is a better explanation, right? And it's the one that we should adopt. The theory that there's actually an apple before me is the one that we should adopt. It would also say, by the way, that we should choose the explanation on the top in this case over the explanation on the bottom. So the bottom is supposed to represent a case where you're hallucinating an apple. There's nothing in front. Okay, so that's a situation in which whatever is before you in the world is very simple. However, the mapping from what's in the world to what's in your head is more complex because there is nothing there before you, as opposed to a situation where it's the apple that's explaining your experience of the apple. So I have argued several times in recent papers and in my book that the principle of minimal divergence plays a key role in scientific methodology, and that therefore methodological naturalists should respect it as well. Before you get completely confused, let me just emphasize that the principle of minimal divergence allows us to accept scientific theories that diverge radically from the way the world appears to be. It just needs to be the case that the only way to do so is, it just needs to be the case that all of the candidate theories, I'm characterizing them as explanatorily empirically adequate, are such that they require that kind of divergence. Okay, so there's no problem with this theory with getting the result that the Earth goes around the sun instead of the sun going around the Earth, even though it looks to us like the sun moves in the sky. That's fine, as long as you have data that requires that explanation. The argument for the principle of minimal divergence playing a key role in scientific methodology turns on thinking about cases where there is a hypothesis, thinking about hypotheses about the world that say that the world is radically different than the way it appears to be, and noting that those kinds of hypotheses are not generally taken seriously as scientific hypotheses. So the kind of hypothesis I have in mind are hypotheses like brain in a vat hypotheses. Okay, so this is a theory on which the world is very different from the way it appears to be, and it's also a theory that isn't taken seriously as a scientific hypothesis. So when we put forward a particular theory about what's going on with fundamental particles, we put forward that theory as a theory about what's going on in the world outside of our brains, not as a theory about the way that the brain in a vat is being stimulated or something like that. And I'm going super fast through this, so apologies for that. You can think that the brain in a vat hypothesis is not the only hypothesis like this. There's a whole range of them. Probably the three easiest to talk about are various kinds of solipsistic idealism, the brain in a vat hypothesis, and the simulation hypotheses. All of these hypotheses are such that if they are true, our best scientific theories would be false. Indeed, they tend to not be taken seriously as alternative versions of scientific hypotheses. And you can ask, why is that the case? Because I think the principle of minimal divergence is a core component of scientific methodology. Unless you are forced to, you shouldn't put forward a hypothesis that says the world's radically different than it appears to be. You might be forced to. That might be the only way to accommodate the data that you have. Right? But unless you're forced to, you should stay as close to the appearances as you can. That's what the principle of minimal divergence says. Okay, and then, as everybody can probably see, a naturalist can build a metaphysical argument from temporal experience around this principle. So you feel the wind blowing against your face. It seems to you like there's something like vital about the present moment that makes it different from the future and past. And you feel like you have that experience as of future events moving from the future to the present to the past. An A theory is a theory that says that what the world is like corresponds in a relatively straightforward way to those experiences. An A theory diverges less from those experiences than a B theory would. That's the idea. So here's a way of thinking about metaphysical arguments from temporal experience in terms of this notion of minimal divergence. So again, you start with some claim about the nature of temporal experience. Then you say that the explanation of that claim is that it diverges least of the comparable options from the way that things appear to be. The explanation that diverges least is some particular metaphysical theory, possibly some version of the A theory. In that sense, the A theory provides the best explanation of the relevant aspect of temporal experience, so we should adopt the A theory. Okay. So let me just say something about, I think all of these things are, skip this step. Let me say something about the questions that I think remain open to us here. So the first is, so like I said, the argument that I just presented to you very quickly, that one naturalistic version of an MTE is built on this principle of minimal divergence. That's all well and good. You might not like that. What other versions of MTEs could methodological naturalists accept? I think that's work that's open to all of you. So what is the relevant sense of best explanation in which the A theory provides better explanations than the B theory for our experience? And does that sense of best explanation play a role in science as well? The second open question is, and the thing that I'm really interested in and what kind of got me started on this project is, it looks to me like this might be a case where two kinds of naturalism conflict. So depending on your view about whether or not A theories really are in tension with our best science, you might have a conflict here between content naturalism and methodological naturalism. And I think that that is intrinsically interesting if we have a conflict. I also, the key thesis of my book is that one of the key theses is that if you're a content naturalist, you have to be a methodological naturalist. So if we get a conflict here, that's going to be especially interesting for me. The third open question that I won't say anything about unless somebody asks about in Q&A is whether or not there are plausible non-naturalistic or maybe extra naturalistic MTEs as well. So methodological naturalism leaves room for metaphysicians to go beyond the methodology of our best science. They just need to respect it when it's possible, right? So there might be non-naturalistic versions of an MTE that you're interested in. There also might just be extra naturalistic. So we exhaust the extra empirical methodology of science, but we have some additional criteria that we use for these philosophical arguments. And I think that that's worth exploring in more detail. And I could say more about in the Q&A, but I won't say it here. I'll put the slides on my website if anybody's interested in seeing more about naturalism and how it plays a role in these arguments in my book.
Thank you. Thank you for an interesting talk. One to touch on a few issues. One is this idea that we have a clear understanding of what our best theories of science are, and the fact is that we don't. They're, if you do a poll, however, among physicists, you will find, for instance, that the many world interpretation is the most popular one, and that I think diverges dramatically from the world of our experience. So I think it would conflict with your not deviate too much from the. And the second issue that I wanted to raise is we should be careful about what we call our experience, because if we try to look at the limited part of our empirical experience and come up with explanations, perhaps the simplest explanations are the ones that are most adapted to the world as it appears to be may be very different from the kind of conclusion we would reach if we look at the complete set of our experiences. For instance, it would be very natural for me to think that whenever somebody turns off the light here, everything around me disappears. That seems to be very close to what the experience seems to show. But I know from many other experiences, from the fact that I have seen other situations like that, from the fact that I have talked with my colleagues and I talk with people, that there are many more aspects that I have to take into account in developing, in considering the complete set of theories. And in that sense, I think it's very important that we distinguish in the experience as we experience it, the part that we associate with the world outside and the part that we play in this explanation. For instance, the sense I get from your talking about time, one would seem to infer that there is this absolute time and there is a passage of absolute times because we experience it. But from talking with all the other colleagues and from experiments that they did and from things that I know happen around there, I know that the passage of time and the amount of time that has passed is relative. I know about special relativity and all the evidence for that, which is not in conflict with my experience once I put myself into the picture and recognize that the experience of the world needs at least two parts, needs to have the world out there and needs to have me as experience. So, well, those are just thoughts that I wanted you to react to. Thank you.
Okay. And the third point, now I'm having trouble remembering all of them, but in my head, the third point was about taking into account all of our experience, not just one aspect of it, and maybe taking into account the way that experience varies across individuals. Sometimes people argue it's culturally or historically variable. For that, I just want to say yes. So yeah, I think that a really good MTE would do that. With respect to the first, okay, I'm remembering the many worlds bit. So yeah, I think that's interesting. There's a number of different ways that a methodological naturalist can go there. So one is, so it doesn't have to be the case that that what most scientists say is our current best theory is in fact our current best theory. So you might argue that something has gone wrong with the current process or something like that. And so that's one way of interpreting those results. What I find more interesting would be to just think about what is it that folks are trying to preserve when they go in for the many worlds theory. And this is that, like, I would like to see a poll about that. So what do they care about? Are they trying to preserve locality? Are they trying to preserve determinism? Do they just want one? Do they think the idea that there's like two fundamental laws, whether it's, Schrodinger and the guidance equation or Schrodinger and a collapse postulate is just like ad hoc, so they just want one fundamental law. So at any rate, I think that would be, it's interesting to try to figure out what that is and then try to build that into your overall methodological naturalist picture. And, I put forward an argument that the principle of minimal divergence belongs in that picture, but I haven't said anything about how it interacts with other extra empirical aspects of reason. So something might happen there. I'll go on to the next question, but happy to.
So, okay, you're like listen 10 minutes. It's like questions. So I'm not everybody's going to be it, but
I'll be on the boat trip so we can talk about it.
Thank you very much. I'm wondering why. When there is a
microphone?
Yes. Yes. Okay, good. So why, when there is a clash between the two kinds of naturalism, should we prefer methodology?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I haven't yet. The reason why I got started thinking about this is because I was trying to find a case where there looks like there was a clash, and then see if I could figure out what to do. One option always is that there's something wrong with my argument. That if you're kind of a naturalist, you have to be a methodological naturalist. And I haven't convinced myself fully that this is one of those cases, but it's the closest I could get. Okay, all that said, I do, as you could tell, Emily, like in the back of my head, I'm thinking that methodological naturalism, if there is a clash, that's the one to stick with. And the reason why, it does go back to now I'm remembering Daniel's first point about, so it's hard to read the content of a scientific theory off of, polls of physicists, what's written in our textbooks. Like sometimes those things conflict. Sometimes they seem like they're in conflict with other theories. What do we do in those kinds of cases? And, I think content naturalism is still plausible. It's because I think there are at least some cases where the content of our best science is super clear. Like the content of our best chemistry says there are more than 4 elements. So like an Aristotelian view about earth, air, fire, and water, that is wrong for content naturalist reasons. But many of the other interesting cases might be harder to discern what the content is. And perhaps for that reason, I'm headed toward, I think, building an argument that for that reason, if you have a conflict, actually methodological naturalism is the one that's more important to respect. And you can kind of reinterpret the content as needed to avoid the conflict. That's a great question.
Thank you for that. Do you hear me?
I do, but
Wait, Chris. Oh, this one. This is better.
No, that should be green.
Oh, I see. Okay. I have to wait a while. Okay. Thank you for that excellent talk, Nina. I think I agree.
I think you just push it once.
Now it's just blinking. It's just giving. It's having a breakdown. So that's gonna talk very badly. So okay.
Yes.
So I think I agree with, so you heard the part that it's an excellent talk. I think I agree with disagree with the very first step. So in philosophy of mind and vision science, people make a big distinction between experience and perception, where experience has to do with phenomenal character and perception has to do with information processing. And vision scientists do not talk about consciousness or phenomenal character or anything like that because it's all over the place. It's just very fuzzy and whatnot. And I think I'm very much with vision scientists. I think no good arguments can be made from phenomenal character or experience, as you call it. Mm-hmm. I think in philosophy of mind, one should never make arguments. And it would be baffling if one should do so. Sorry, in philosophy of mind, one should never make arguments from phenomenal character. No argument. And it would be baffling if one should make arguments from phenomenal character in metaphysics. Mm-hmm. So, but now, of course, one should pay a bit of attention to how things seem to us. I get that part. But why go that far is my question, basically. Like here's an alternative that I would find, so in almost every dimension, the way things seem to us is highly at odds with how things actually are at a, microscopic level. And it would be surprising if time were any different. And here's something that I would love to hear about, which is an explanation for why there is such a massive mismatch between how the world seems to us in temporal dimensions and how it in fact is, assuming that the theory is true. And then, an alternative to saying that there is a metaphysical argument from temporal experience is that there's a metaphysical argument that also takes seriously the fact that we experience the passage of time. But what I'm guessing is that there's just going to be 2 very different levels of explanation. One having to do with macroscopic phenomena in the world and how they appear to us. And one having to do with physical explanation. So why not go that route is basically the question.
Yeah, good. So a piece of me partly wants to respond by saying that, so I am taking a position in a sort of a part of the literature that's already up and running. So you have, in addition to folks making arguments like that, you have folks critiquing them, not on the grounds, sometimes they critique them on the grounds that you're pretty poor, but at least some people are willing to buy into the project. But they say, well, we can give an alternative explanation, so I don't need to go in for your like spooky theory or whatever. And it's really to that kind of group that I think that this is addressed. So folks who are willing to engage with these kinds of arguments and think that at least before we learned anything about science or anything else, our experience is relevant to trying to figure out what the world is like, and trying to get them some more resources for playing with that kind of argument. The last part of your question, which is like maybe there's, maybe our experience tells us something about what the macro physical world is like, or like the macro world, but then there's a separate question about what, this is how I read it at least, what the fundamental world is like. That is really interesting. And an interesting part of the talk that I didn't get to was about whether or not the principle of minimal divergence can help us can weigh in favor or against theories, not just about what the macro physical world is like, but what things are fundamentally like as well. I argue that it can. I think that's like the most controversial part of the argument for just an extension of the reasons that I've reported before. So we don't adopt radical hypotheses about what the world is like unless we feel that we have to. We also don't adopt radical hypotheses about what the world is like at the fundamental level. So just like we don't take the bringing of that hypothesis seriously as when we're doing science, we also don't take the bringing of that and giving rise to ordinary three-dimensional objects on a Chalmers style view. That's also off the table, in my view, for the same principle of minimal divergence reason. So that's a way in which the principle might get you not just what the world is like at the sort of level at which we interact with it, but also at the fundamental level. But that's a controversial extension.
I mean, the thing is that for every species, the world is completely different at a phenomenal level. I mean, this is study, like the world looks completely different to different species. So why should our human perception somehow be a privileged access to what it's actually like? I don't know. It seems like a really. Anyway,
I mean, you might think that there are like details of our experience that vary across species, but there are like key very broad aspects of it that are consistent. So I first started making these arguments thinking about various versions of quantum ontology that say the fundamental space is really high dimensional. So you might think that like even if the world looks different to the cat than it looks to me, we all see things as three-dimensional. You might say the same thing about the passage of time. Those are empirical questions that we'd have to investigate more, and they might raise issues. Okay, I'm stopping now.
Yeah, I'll actually really quick.
Okay.
Questions. It's really interesting talk. I think I was completely baffled by the central toy case, which is the apples. I mean, for two reasons. One is you sort of drew. I mean, it was like you had a picture in the head of an apple outside. So you drew on the fact that we're like sort of looking at it from the outside, as though we have a notion of similarity between what's in the head and what's outside the head that we could apply in the way that example required. Second, when you said it's obvious to us that the first is going to be more the first explanation is going to be more complicated than the second. And I was like, why would you think that? I mean, presumably it's some sort of causes. So what would you mean here by more complicated? More parameters in the equation, or it's going to require a bunch of confluence of a lot of independent causal factors? You said nothing about that. My initial reaction was, well, tell me more. And what are the two explanations? You've got some object outside, it's a causal process, it's producing something in the head. In the one case, and also with the other case. And I don't know why you would say that. I don't know what you meant by more complicated. I don't know why it was obvious that we have this kind of external gauge of similarity between what's in the head and what's outside, a kind of meta perspective outside of our heads to compare our experiences with what causes the experience. None of that I understand.
Yeah, I mean, what I'm going to say is, given your critique of the meta perspective not going to be helpful, what I was thinking is that there is just a straightforward mapping in the first explanation of features of the thing in the world that I'm looking at and my experience. Like looking at something red and I'm having experience as I'm looking at a red thing. Looking at something round, I'm having experience as I'm looking at a round thing, as opposed to looking at something that's very different. And so there was some more complicated mapping. But I suspect you're going to just reject all of that. So, okay, let's talk.
Very last question, Bucky.
Thank you. I think of myself as scientific as the next person in my adult, but I do not think that methodological naturalism applies to methods is helpful as a guide to metaphysics. And in fact, I think it can be positively harmful. So let me give an example of the history of logic. Russell and Whitehead used various two-functional connectors in and so on. Scheffer, I think in the 1920s, realized you could just do with one connector. Russell said this was the greatest contribution to logic of recent times. Why? Because he was thinking of the two-functional connectors in the same way as the elements. We had discovered there was only one element instead of seven. Now let's continue. Nikon discovered a single axiom using this single two-functional connector. So we have now just one principle. This axiom is horrible. Then the Poles came along and found the shortest axiom that you can have. Then Quine came along and said, we don't need the quantifiers as well as the connectors. We can have a special Scheffer-type quantifier for which just one thing, from which we can get the usual quantifiers and the connectors. This whole research program was a piece of nonsense as far as I'm concerned. Nonsense in the sense it's of no real interest. And why was it regarded as being of such interest? Because of a misguided view of an analogy between what they were doing and what science requires. They thought these connectives and so on and these principles should be regarded in the same way as the elements of chemistry or physics, and in the same way as the fundamental laws of nature. This methodology is a blunderbuss. You have to look at specific problems and be sensitive to what they require.
So far be it from me to do any harm to metaphysics. Really want to do that. Yeah, I mean, I guess mostly what I want to say is that it seems to me like that's a case in which the methodological naturalists can claim that they were just wrong about what they thought the methodology of science was. It sounds to me, so I don't know the cases that you're talking about as well as you do, but it sounds to me like there's emphasis on a certain kind of simplicity that is misplaced. And I think simplicity is one of the hard, so as soon as you start talking about extra empirical reasoning in science, the first thing everybody thinks of is something like Occam's razor. I think that is a big mess to start there. So the kind of principle I was talking about today is a kind of simplicity. I think there's a whole bunch of other ones. That one I think works. A whole bunch of other ones I think are not actually consistently part of scientific methodology. They might be context-dependent parts of scientific methodology. So I think that that's just a case where we got it wrong. And it has a little bit, your objection then has a little bit of a flavor to me of that initial worry that I put forward, which is like, this might be harmful to metaphysics because we might be led astray, because we might think that the methodology of science is this, but it's not, and then make a whole bunch of errors. Like, yeah, it might be hard to figure out what the methodology of science is, and it might, if we're making mistakes about that, it might lead us astray. But I don't think that's a reason not to accept the view.
Very short one. My point was simply you cannot read off from that principle how to proceed in metaphysics. It provides us with no guidance.
But the methodological naturalist doesn't have to accept that we should read off from that principle how to proceed in metaphysics. There needs to be an argument that that principle is actually part of the methodology of science. That's what I'm calling into question.
Cool. So I'm apologizing with the people that wanted to ask the question, but this is very English. And thank you.